After months of playing hide-and-seek games, President Alassane Ouattara of Côte d'Ivoire has announced last week that he will be running for a controversial fourth term in the country's presidential election to be held October 2025. His announcement to run for a fourth term isn't just about one man's hunger for power. It's about the dangerous pattern of African leaders who refuse to step down, a pattern that has historically led to bloodshed, civil wars, and collapsed democracies across our continent. Ivory Coast knows this story all too well. When Laurent Gbagbo refused to step down in 2010, it triggered a brutal civil war that killed over 3,000 people and displaced millions. When Ouattara himself ran for an illegal third term in 2020, at least 85 people died in election violence while opposition parties boycotted the polls. Now, with major opposition candidates systematically disqualified and France's neocolonial interests at stake, Ouattara's fourth term bid threatens to push Africa's largest cocoa producer back into the abyss of political violence. The question isn't whether he will win this rigged election, it's whether Ivory Coast can survive another stolen mandate without breaking apart completely. In this episode, we're going to dive deep into how Ouattara's constitutional coup mirrors the sit-tight syndrome, destroying African democracies, how this fourth term bid could trigger another cycle of deadly election violence, and why this moment represents a critical test for Africa's fight against neocolonialism. President Ouattara's fourth term announcement isn't an isolated incident. It's part of a deadly pattern that has plagued African politics for decades. From Cameroon's Paul Biya at 92, seeking his eighth term, to Uganda's Museveni scrapping age limit to rule for life, to Guinea's Alpha Conde, who was violently overthrown after trying the same constitutional manipulation that Ouattara is attempting now. This is the sit-tight syndrome, and it kills democracy one stolen term at a time. The pattern is always the same. Leaders change constitutions, eliminate term limits, and create legal justifications for what everyone knows is fundamentally illegal. Ouattara claims the 2016 constitutional revision reset his term count, but this is the exact same excuse used by every African dictator who has ever refused to step down. It's the same playbook that led to Guinea's military coup in 2021 when Colonel Mamadi Doumbouya arrested Alpha Conde precisely because he tried to cling to power through constitutional manipulation. The 2010-2011 post-election crisis that brought Ouattara to power killed over 3,000 people. His controversial third term in 2020 left 85 people dead. Now, he's betting that Ivorians will accept a fourth stolen term without resistance. But across Africa, we've seen that when leaders push too far, the consequences are catastrophic. While Ouattara poses as the experienced leader Ivory Coast needs, he's actually following the same destructive path that has turned promising African nations into failed states. To understand why Ouattara's fourth term could break Ivory Coast, you need to understand the country's brutal history of election violence. This isn't just political competition, it's a matter of life and death, and the pattern is always the same. Disputed elections, refused transitions, and rivers of blood. The 2010-2011 crisis began exactly like today's situation. Laurent Gbagbo, the sitting president, refused to accept electoral defeat and allegedly manipulated the Constitutional Council to declare himself the winner. The result? Over 3,000 people were killed, entire neighborhoods burned, and French military intervention bombed Gbagbo out of the presidential palace. Fast forward to 2020, and we saw the same deadly script. When Ouattara announced his controversial third term, violence erupted almost immediately. At least 85 people were killed in protests and ethnic clashes. Opposition parties boycotted the election, calling it a constitutional coup. Entire regions became no-go zones as youth took to the streets with machetes and hunting rifles. The only reason the death toll wasn't higher is because the opposition chose to boycott over all-out resistance. Now Ouattara is gambling with those same lives again. He systematically eliminated every major opposition candidate, creating the same conditions that led to previous explosions of violence. When people feel they have no voice in the democratic process, when courts are corrupted and elections are rigged, they turn to the street. And in Ivory Coast, street protests quickly become ethnic conflict that tear communities apart. The question isn't whether violence will erupt, it's how many people will die this time. While Mali, Burkina Faso, and Niger, and even Senegal have expelled French forces and asserted their sovereignty, Ivory Coast remains France's last major stronghold in West Africa, and Ouattara is the gatekeeper protecting that new colonial fortress. His fourth term bid isn't about serving Ivorians, He's about serving his masters in Paris who need their most loyal African puppet to stay in power. Let's be clear about how Ouattara came to power. He was literally installed by French bombs. When Gbagbo refused to step down in 2011, it was French helicopters and tanks that blasted him out of office and handed power to Alassane Ouattara. For over a decade, he has been France's most reliable African client, keeping the CFA franc flowing, French corporation profitable, and Ivory Coast cocoa wealth streaming to European chocolate makers. The timing of his fourth-term announcement is no coincidence, as anti-French sentiments sweep across Africa and military government kicks out colonial forces. France desperately needs Ouattara to hold the line. His theatrical announcement of French troop withdrawal is pure deception, a coordinated retreat designed to deflect criticism while maintaining French control behind the scenes. The military agreements remain. French corporations still dominate the economy, and the CFA franc still drains African wealth into French treasuries. This is why major opposition figures like Tidjane were systematically disqualified from the race. Ouattara's fourth term ensures none of that happens. The chains of neocolonialism remain firmly in place, even as the rest of the world breaks free. President Ouattara's path to a fourth term reveals exactly how modern neocolonialism destroys Africa's democracy. This isn't a free and fair election. It's a carefully orchestrated elimination of opposition that would make any dictator proud, carried out with the full blessing of Western powers who preach democracy while protecting their puppet regimes. First, they eliminated Tidjane, the former Credit Suisse CEO, who posed the biggest threat. Court disqualified him on a technicality about French citizenship, the same nationality weapon once used against Ouattara himself, now wielded by him against his rivals. Then came Laurent Gbagbo, barred from contesting despite his ICC acquittal because Ivorian court, controlled by Ouattara's system, maintained his conviction. When thousands of Ivorians protested these exclusions in June, demanding Tien's reinstatement and chanting corrupt justice, the response was swift and brutal. Democratic space was squeezed, protests were banned, and the message was clear: dissent will not be tolerated. This is how you create the conditions for violence. When people have no legal means to express their political will, they turn to other methods. The international community's silence is deafening. ECOWAS, which condemns military coups in the Sahel, says nothing about this constitutional coup. The African Union, which claims to defend democratic governance, watches quietly as one of its members eliminate political competition. France and the European Union, who lecture Africa about democracy, maintain their support for a leader who is systematically destroying democratic institutions. This double standard exposes the lie of Western commitment to African democracy. They only support it when it serves their own interests. Ouattara's desperate bid to cling to power is happening as a wave of African liberation sweeps across the continent, and his colonial stronghold is increasingly isolated. Every country that borders Ivory Coast has experienced political upheavals that have shifted power away from pro-Western elites, and the momentum is building towards genuine African independence. Look at the map. Mali expelled French forces after revolutionary leaders decided to prioritize African sovereignty over Western approval. Burkina Faso's Captain Ibrahim Traoré has become Pan-African icon for his anti-imperialist stance and youth appeal. Even traditionally pro-French Senegal elected Bassirou Faye, who represents a new generation rejecting neo-colonial dependency. The digital revolution is amplifying this resistance. Across social media platforms, young Africans are connecting with a broader Pan-African movement that sees through the lies of puppet democracy. They are creating memes comparing Ouattara to other presidents for life and linking Ivory Coast struggles to liberation movement across the continent. This isn't just about one election. It's part of a continental awakening that rejects the entire post-colonial political order. The jihadist expansion that Ouattara claims requires his continued leadership is actually being fueled by the same neo-colonial policies he represents. When governments serve foreign interests rather than their own people, extremist groups fill the legitimacy vacuum. The same pattern we've seen in Mali, Burkina Faso, and Niger is playing out in Ivory Coast, where young people increasingly view their government as a puppet regime that prioritizes French profit over African development. Behind Ouattara's political manipulation lies the brutal economic reality that explains why France will never voluntarily let go of Ivory Coast. The cocoa industry that generates billions for European corporations while keeping African farmers in poverty. This is neocolonialism in its purest form. Africa provides the labor and resources. Europe takes the profit. Ivory Coast produces 45% of the world's cocoa, feeding a $100 billion global chocolate industry. Yet, Ivorian farmers remain trapped in poverty, surviving on less than $1.20 per day. Under Ouattara's 14-year rule, this system of exploitation has only deepened. While he boasts about GDP growth, over half of cocoa farmers still live below the poverty line, unable to afford basic healthcare or education for their children. Ivory Coast ships raw cocoa beans to Europe, where French and German companies process them into chocolate and captures 95% of the value chain. The country that feeds the world's chocolate addiction can barely afford to buy chocolate for its own people. This is economic colonialism, designed to keep Africa as a supplier of raw materials, while Europeans control the profitable processing and marketing. The CFA franc, controlled by French Treasury, ensures that even when cocoa prices rises, the benefit still flows to European banks rather than African communities. Every CFA franc printed must be backed by euro held in French banks, giving Paris veto power over Ivory Coast's monetary policy. This isn't partnership, it's financial slavery disguised as monetary cooperation. Ouattara's fourth term ensures none of these changes. A truly independent leader might demand processing facilities built in Africa, break free from the CFA franc system, or nationalize key industries. His continued rule guarantees that Ivory Coast remains what it has always been under French influence, a plantation economy serving European masters. The fourth term that could break Ivory Coast isn't just about one aging dictator's refusal to step down. It represents the final battle between African liberation and European neocolonialism. Ouattara's desperate gambit to cling to power comes at a moment when the entire colonial system is cracking, and his stolen mandate could be the spark that ignites a broader African revolution. The contradictions are becoming impossible to ignore. How can the continent that produces the world's cocoa, gold, uranium, and oil remain the poorest region on earth? How can countries with vast natural resources see their wealth flow to European banks while their people live in poverty? How can leaders who promise change continue the same policies that have failed for 6 decades? Ouattara's fourth term may succeed in short term, but is fighting against the tide of history. The Africa that emerged from colonialism is dying, and the new Africa is being born. One that demands true sovereignty, economic justice, and leaders who serve African interests rather than European ones. The youth uprising across the continent, from Nigeria's NSAS to Kenyan Gen Z protests, shows that a new generation refuses to accept the limitations imposed by their parent generation. The choice facing Ivory Coast is the choice facing all of Africa. Continue serving as a French plantation where Africans provide labor while Europeans take profit, or join the liberation movement reshaping the continent from the Sahel to Southern Africa. President Ouattara's fourth term won't bring Ivory Coast spirit, but the resistance to it might finally break the chains of neocolonialism that have bound Africa for far too long. The revolution may not come through the ballot box, but it's already happening in the hearts and minds of Africans who refuse to be anyone's puppet. This is Frontline Africa. If you value truth unfiltered and power reframed from an African perspective, subscribe, like, and drop your thoughts in the comments. I am Ezekiel Enejeta. See you in the next one.